We all know that every community has that one person, the almost leader, the nearly hero, the figure everyone thought would rise, until everything fell apart. Sometimes it's a missed chance. Sometimes it's bad timing. And sometimes it's like life flips the table just when the crown is inches away. Abdullah ibn Ubayy lived that kind of story. Grand hopes, dramatic turns, and an ending nobody expected. In today's video, we'll talk about how a man who nearly became Yathrib's king lost everything the moment destiny walked through the city gates. So let's not waste any time, and let's begin. Before Yathrib was a city etched permanently into the heart of Islamic history. It was a fragile patchwork of two tribes, the Aws and the Khazraj, locked in a rivalry that stretched back generations. Their alliances were as unstable as desert wind, shifting and settling in unpredictable ways. Beneath that landscape of tense truces and old grudges, one figure was slowly becoming the closest thing Yathrib had to a calming center: Abdullah ibn Ubayy ibn Salul. If you had wandered through the markets a few years before the Hijrah, you might have heard his name spoken with admiration. Some said he had the mind of a diplomat. Others said he had the patience of someone who'd grown tired of endless tribal feuds. Whispers followed him wherever he went, whispers that suggested the people were ready, maybe even eager, for him to become their ruler. Not a conqueror, not a tyrant, but a unifying figure, a king in all but ceremony. Abdullah didn't need royal trappings to feel the pull of that destiny. He had already mastered the delicate art of making himself indispensable. When tempers flared between clans, he soothed them. When negotiations stalled, he shifted the tone. He seemed to know exactly when to speak, and when silence would serve him better. Over time, both Aws and Khazraj found themselves leaning toward the idea of placing the city's future in his hands. He certainly wasn't loved by everyone, no leader ever is, but he was respected widely enough that the possibility of him becoming the acknowledged head of Yathrib felt increasingly natural. Even the Aws, who had once bristled at any Khazraj figure rising too high, had begun accepting the role he was destined to play. It wasn't just his personality, it was timing, circumstance, and the weariness that settled into a city divided for too long. This wasn't the kind of authority carved in the heat of battle. It wasn't earned through a victorious banner or a dramatic moment of triumph. It grew from fatigue, from the collective exhale of a community tired of spilling blood over disputes no one remembered the origins of. Abdullah stepped into that emptiness with a gentle confidence, believing, quite reasonably, that he was the answer the city needed. And in his private moments, he allowed himself to imagine it fully. A peaceful Yathrib, a united people. His name spoken with reverence as the leader who pulled them out of old patterns and guided them into something new. It wasn't arrogance. It was hope, and a sense of inevitability that wrapped around him like a warm cloak. But even in those hopeful days, his influence rested on a delicate balance. Many supported him because it seemed the easiest path to stability. Others supported him because they feared the alternative. And always, in the backdrop, lingered the unease of infighting, the scars of battles like Bu'ath, and the unmistakable truth that unity held together by exhaustion could crumble if tested by something stronger. Abdullah didn't see that danger then. Most people don't notice the cracks in the ground when their eyes are fixed on the horizon. He believed his moment was coming, that Yathrib was ready to shape itself around him. And then, on an ordinary day like any other, the city received visitors from the south. They weren't warriors or diplomats. They came quietly, humbly, carrying only their faith and their hope for refuge. The arrival didn't come with trumpets, yet it carried enough power to shift every future that rested in Yathrib's hands, including Abdullah's. Destiny was stepping into the city, wrapped in dust from the road, and Abdullah ibn Ubayy had no idea that these travelers were about to dim the glow of the crown he thought was already waiting for him. It happened quietly at first, almost gently, the way a breeze slips into a room before anyone realizes the window was open. Yathrib had seen travelers before. Traders, wanderers, families seeking new beginnings. So when a group of tired believers from Mecca began settling in, no one immediately sensed how history was rearranging itself. But change often arrives without fanfare. It doesn't need to announce itself. It simply begins. The people of Yathrib didn't just welcome the Muhajirun out of hospitality. They welcomed them out of hope. Word had already spread of the Prophet Muhammad, his character, his message, the quiet dignity with which he carried himself. The clans who had secretly pledged allegiance to him in Aqaba knew exactly what his presence meant. They weren't bringing in a refugee. They were inviting in a leader. And for Abdullah ibn Ubayy, this was the first tremor beneath his feet. He hadn't been consulted in these secret pledges. He hadn't approved them. They happened around him, beneath him, and without him. That was the first sign that the influence he believed unshakable might not be as solid as he once thought. People were making bold decisions, life-altering decisions, without waiting to see what he thought of them. When the Prophet finally entered Yathrib, the city shifted in a way Abdullah couldn't have predicted. Streets that once murmured his name now echoed with excitement for someone else. The people gathered, smiling and calling out praises, and Abdullah watched a tide move past him toward a man who had never expressed desire for political authority. But authority doesn't always emerge because someone seeks it. Sometimes it arrives because people recognize something in a person that they trust more deeply than they trust their own ambitions. The shift wasn't immediate, though. No one pointed at Abdullah and said, "Your time is over." No one mocked him publicly or stripped him of his standing. Instead, everything changed subtly. Invitations he once received first began arriving later. Decisions he once finalized became collective discussions. His opinion still mattered, but it no longer carried the quiet weight of inevitability. It was like watching the sun rise slowly behind another mountain, realizing you had been the tallest peak for so long without noticing how small your shadow really was. Abdullah still held on to dignity. He still attended meetings, still spoke with authority, still walked the streets of his clan with the bearing of a leader. But internally, he felt the unexpected shift. Yathrib didn't simply accept the Prophet thus. It realigned itself around him. Old feuds softened. Former enemies sat together. Hearts changed. A community that once needed Abdullah to calm its storms suddenly found its storms calming on their own. That was perhaps the part that stung the most. Abdullah had spent years positioning himself as the man who could bring unity, Yet unity arrived without him. Peace settled onto the city's shoulders without being negotiated through his influence. The prophet never acted like a rival, never claimed authority, never boasted, never dismissed Abdullah. But that didn't matter. The people sensed steadiness in him, and steadiness is a powerful form of leadership. Abdullah watched the city transform, bit by bit. What he saw as his rightful future began dissolving like morning mist. The role he expected to inherit slipped away, not through betrayal, but through something far harder to fight: sincere admiration. At first, he tried to ignore the growing feeling in his chest, something tight, uncomfortable, bitter at the edges. He told himself things would balance out, that he still mattered, that people couldn't simply forget all he had done. And for a while, he managed to keep that bitterness buried. Because resentment doesn't explode the moment change arrives. It grows in quiet places, behind polite smiles, beneath forced nods of agreement, in the empty spaces where authority once fit comfortably. Abdullah didn't resent the prophet personally, not yet, but he resented what the prophet's presence meant for him, for the future he believed had been promised to him. And as Yathrib continued reshaping itself around this new center of gravity, Abdullah ibn Ubayy found himself drifting slowly, steadily, from the man who would lead to the elder who watched, a role he never wanted, never accepted, and never learned how to live with. And that is where the next part of his story begins, where disappointment settles into the quiet corners of the heart, waiting for the moment it decides to surface. The change didn't strike like lightning. It crept in slowly, the way evening shadows lengthen until you suddenly realize the sun is gone. Abdullah ibn Ubayy tried to remain composed through it all, to walk with the same steady confidence, to speak with the same firm cadence, to remind people of the leader they had once believed he would be. But it's hard to pretend nothing has changed when everything around you behaves as if it has. At first, he noticed the small things. A conversation would shift toward the prophet whenever people discussed solutions, even in matters Abdullah once handled alone. His opinions were still heard, but no longer echoed. People nodded out of courtesy, not conviction. Those polite gestures cut more deeply than outright rejection ever could. Courtesy feels a lot like pity when a man senses he is no longer necessary. The alliances he had cultivated with such care were quietly bending towards someone else. Men who once looked to him instinctively now looked beyond him, searching for the prophet's guidance. It wasn't rebellion. It wasn't betrayal. It was admiration. And admiration is a far more unstoppable force than any political rivalry. Abdullah felt it most painfully in his own tribe. The Khazraj had anchored their hopes in him for years, imagining the peace and unity he would bring to their conflict-ridden city. But unity had arrived by another path, not through Abdullah's carefully woven diplomacy, but through the sincerity and moral authority of a man who had never asked to be their king. The Khazraj weren't abandoning Abdullah deliberately. They were simply giving their hearts to someone who answered needs far deeper than governance. And what pierced him most was that the prophet had never taken anything from him intentionally. There was no challenge, no declaration of leadership, no demand for loyalty, just presence. just character, just a quiet, gentle gravity that drew people in. For a man whose entire identity was rooted in being the center of political balance, this natural shift felt like the ground slipping beneath his feet. In private moments, Abdullah wrestled with emotions he had never learned to name. He had spent so long walking through Yathrib, knowing exactly who he was, what he represented, what people expected from him. Now, every day carved another small piece away from that certainty. His pride, once solid and reassuring, felt bruised in places he didn't want to acknowledge. Rumors didn't help. People whispered about the new bonds forming between Adawaz, Khazra, and the Muhajirun. Some said this new unity was a blessing. Others said it reflected Yathrib's true future. Abdallah heard these whispers, always accompanied by hopeful tones that had once been reserved for him. He had become the man people respected historically, but did not rely on presently. The shift hurt in a way he couldn't express without sounding petty or insecure. Two things he never believed himself to be. Even the city's atmosphere changed. Streets felt livelier. Disputes resolved more quickly. Neighbors who once glared began greeting each other with warmth. It was the kind of peace Abdullah had dreamed of creating, but seeing it bloom without him felt like watching someone else raise a child you believed should have been yours. He found himself growing quieter in gatherings, not out of humility, but out of a growing suspicion that no matter what he said, the people around him were waiting, patiently, politely, for the prophet to speak instead. He could feel the center of gravity pulling away from him, and every day made it harder to deny. There were moments when he wondered if perhaps he could adapt, step into a different role, reshape his purpose. But pride is a stubborn companion. It whispers reminders of old promises and old triumphs, clinging to what could have been. And Abdullah, despite all his political skill, couldn't easily untangle himself from the identity he'd built over decades. Isolation doesn't always come from being pushed away. Sometimes it comes from feeling unnecessary. And in a city that no longer depended on him, Abdullah felt the sting of that realization settle deeper with each passing month. Where pride dwells unchallenged, humility might soften the edges. But where pride is wounded, something else begins to grow, quietly, slowly, in the shadowed corners of the heart. Something that asks, not loudly, but persistently, what happens when humiliation goes unanswered? Resentment rarely announces itself. It doesn't break down doors or roar into the streets. It slips in quietly, settles in the chest, and begins reshaping the way a man sees the world. That was how it grew inside Abdullah ibn Ubayy, not as rage, not as an open challenge, but as a slow rearranging of loyalties inside his own heart. He still walked through Yathrib with dignity. He still greeted people with measured calm. But beneath that polished exterior, something had begun to shift. He understood that open defiance would shatter whatever influence he still held. The prophet wasn't a tyrant. He didn't silence critics or crush rivals. If anything, his openness made resistance harder, not easier. You cannot rebel loudly against someone who has never wronged you publicly. So, Abdullah chose a different path, one that threaded itself through shadows and quiet corners rather than public courtyards. He maintained the face of cooperation. He attended meetings. He offered suggestions. He nodded along when decisions were made. On the surface, he appeared to accept the new order of things. Many believed he was adapting, reshaping himself into a supportive elder. And perhaps part of him wished he could, but the other part, the larger part, felt displaced, diminished, and increasingly invisible. That part refused to sit quietly. His frustration didn't erupt into dramatic gestures or outright rebellion. Instead, it expressed itself in softer ways. A raised eyebrow during a discussion, a hesitant tone when someone praised the Prophet du'as, a quiet remark that things used to be different. These tiny cracks mattered. People noticed them even when he wished they wouldn't. Some dismissed them, others absorbed them. A few carried them forward, whispering them into receptive ears. Subtle resistance often spreads faster than open anger because it feels like simple observation, not rebellion. Abdullah became the master of this kind of resistance. He knew Yathrib's social circles intimately. Who gossiped, who complained, who doubted, who still felt unsure about these changes sweeping over their city. He didn't confront them with arguments. He simply let his own discomfort show, just enough to resonate. He played to uncertainty, to nostalgia, to the fear that comes when the ground shifts too quickly beneath one's feet. But resentment is a dangerous companion. It doesn't stay small, no matter how quietly it begins. It grows roots. It seeks company. It waits for opportunities. And the more Abdullah saw Yathrib changing without him, the more that quiet resistance felt like the only thing he had left to cling to. Publicly, he remained composed. He had to. Backing away from leadership entirely would strip him of the dignity he still possessed. And so, he walked a narrow path, supportive enough to be accepted, distant enough to preserve his pride. People couldn't accuse him of undermining anything because his actions never crossed into overt sabotage. But they could sense something unsettled in him, a tension that clung to his words and hovered behind his politeness. It wasn't just politics, it was identity. The man who once envisioned himself as the stabilizing force of Yathrib now felt like an extra piece on a board that had reorganized itself without warning. His authority didn't vanish all at once, but it thinned. It became symbolic rather than real. And Abdullah, who had once wielded influence like a skilled craftsman, now found himself improvising just to maintain relevance. He was respected, yes, but respect without power feels hollow, especially to someone who once stood at the brink of becoming a unifying leader. So the shadow he stepped into didn't swallow him. It reshaped him. He wasn't the man who led from the front anymore. He was the man whose presence reminded the city of what had almost been. That place in history, half broken, half preserved, carried its own bitterness. And as that bitterness deepened, it began altering not just his private thoughts, but the way he behaved in public. His speeches became vaguer. His tone, lighter on the surface, carried subtle friction beneath it. His expression, courteous as always, sometimes revealed a flicker of disapproval before smoothing over. Soon, people began to whisper that Abdullah seemed different, not openly hostile, not rebellious, but changed in a way they couldn't quite name. And that subtle shift, barely noticeable at first, would shape his relationships, his reputation, and the choices he made next. Which leads us into the next part of his story, where this tension between his public mask and private frustration begins to reshape how he speaks, how he moves, and how the people of Yathrib see him. It didn't take long for people to sense that something was shifting in the way Abdullah ibn Ubayy carried himself. It wasn't dramatic. He never raised his voice, never stormed away from a gathering, never declared himself wronged. But those who watched him closely noticed the subtle split forming in his behavior. He was becoming a man with two tones, two manners, two faces, depending entirely on who stood before him. In public, he remained the respectful elder, the composed statesman who had guided Yathrib through years of tension. He greeted the prophet with courteous words, offered practical suggestions in meetings, and maintained that steady presence he had cultivated for decades. If someone were to judge him solely by his public gestures, they would assume he had fully embraced the new order of things. His smiles were polite, his voice steady. Nothing seemed out of place. But private conversations told a different story. Behind shaded doorways and in gatherings where only a few trusted ears listened, his tone shifted. He didn't rage. Abdullah was too calculating for that. Instead, his comments took the form of careful questions. Questions that nudged doubt into hearts without ever naming themselves as criticisms. "Is this the pace of change we expected?" he would ask softly. "Are all decisions being made with our tribe's interests in mind?" Another evening, he might remark, "Things are different now. Not necessarily worse, just different." One must wonder what the future holds for those who once led. These words weren't accusations. They were invitations, open doors into circles of unease, and people stepped through them, especially those who still felt nervous about how quickly Yathrib was transforming. Abdullah's confidence lay in this ability to speak two languages at once. In the prophet's presence, he was cooperative. In his own gatherings, he was contemplative, nostalgic, gently critical. He never uttered anything that could be quoted as treacherous, but he also never fully supported the changes reshaping his city. He was walking a razor-thin line, trying to preserve influence in both worlds. The trouble with walking two paths at once, though, is that neither path can be walked well. His clan sensed his discomfort even as they tried to stand by him. The Muhajirun sensed his hesitation beneath the courtesy. And the city, now more unified, more alert, more spiritually attuned, wasn't as easy to sway as it once had been. People listened, but they didn't commit. They agreed, politely, then forgot the conversation as soon as they stepped outside. His influence was stretching thinner by the day, even as he tried to hold it together with the old tools of diplomacy and subtlety. Still, Abdullah clung to the idea that he could balance both sides. He believed he could be respected by the prophet while still preserving the loyalties of those who missed the old tribal hierarchy. He thought he could exist in the space between acceptance and resistance, quietly shaping the city from behind the scenes. But duplicity carries its own weight. It exhausts the spirit and erodes the certainty of every action. Abdullah began feeling this pressure in the smallest ways. The lingering looks from people who suspected his true feelings, the guarded tone of those who once confided in him, the way conversations suddenly shifted when he approached. He was losing trust, not because of anything he said openly, but because people sensed he was saying something else elsewhere. And beneath all this, the prophet remained kind, patient and transparent, which only made Abdullah's inner conflict heavier. How does one resist a man who shows no hostility? How does one maintain the illusion of loyalty while feeling increasingly invisible? Abdullah tried. He tried harder than anyone realized. But carrying two faces in one city is a burden that grows heavier every day. The fault lines beneath his calm exterior gradually widened, thin cracks stretching towards something larger, something that would eventually break through. And of course, where cracks appear, pressure follows. And pressure often leads to confrontation, even when no one intends it. The earliest signs of that tension, small at first, but unmistakable, would begin to reveal themselves soon enough. It started with whispers, so small they barely seemed worth noticing. Just a word here, a sigh there, a subtle remark spoken in the company of those who were supposed to keep it private. Abdullah ibn Ubayy never intended for his comments to travel far. He was careful, or at least he believed he was. His criticisms were framed as thoughtful reflections, never accusations. His doubts were phrased as gentle concerns, never outright opposition. But words are wind, and in a place like Medina, where hearts were softening, loyalties were forming, and the community was becoming more cohesive than ever, wind travels fast. What began as quiet murmurs among friends drifted beyond the circles he thought he controlled. A half sentence uttered in frustration found its way into the ears of someone less sympathetic. A remark meant to stir introspection ended up stirring suspicion instead. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, people began to question whether Abdullah's public cooperation matched his private thoughts. The companions of the Prophet were not naive. They came from Mecca, hardened by persecution, sharpened by hardship, and deeply intuitive about sincerity. They could sense when someone meant what they said, and when someone was speaking to maintain appearances. So when small, troubling comments began circulating, comments that hinted at discomfort with the Prophet's leadership or resentment toward how the city was changing, they paid attention. Not all the words were new. Some were simply old tribal sentiments resurfacing through Abdullah's voice. Remarks like, "Our people used to lead these gatherings," or "This city is changing faster than we can keep up," might have seemed harmless on their own. But in the new Medina, where unity was becoming the foundation of survival, such remarks carried weight. And when a few comments reached the Prophet himself, the response was not anger. He didn't confront Abdullah. He didn't expose him or scold him. Instead, he showed patience, as he always did. But that patience didn't erase the tension growing quietly beneath the surface. Even if the Prophet offered grace, others found it harder to overlook what they interpreted as ingratitude or duplicity. Some companions spoke openly about their concerns. Others held their reservations quietly, watching Abdullah with new eyes. The atmosphere around him shifted, nothing dramatic, just a subtle tightening whenever he entered a room, a slight pause before people responded to his suggestions, a moment of hesitation before accepting his words at face value. Suspicion doesn't need to be spoken aloud to be felt. Abdullah felt it too. He sensed the careful glances, the polite but firmer tones, the way people began measuring his words instead of trusting them. For a man who had once been the unchallenged mediator of the city, this slow erosion of confidence was a wound he tried desperately to hide. Yet even as caution grew around him, he continued to speak in two directions. It was not intentional sabotage, at least not yet, but the product of a heart caught between pride and a rapidly changing reality. The more he felt sidelined, the more he needed to reaffirm his value in private circles. And the more he spoke privately, the more those words escaped into public spaces. It became a pattern. He whispered something to a trusted friend. The friend repeated it to someone else, adding a touch of their own interpretation. The softened criticism became a sharper rumor. And eventually, the rumor returned to the very people Abdullah would have preferred never heard it. The city was changing, but so was the world around it. News of conflict, of tensions with the Quraysh, of caravans attacked, of battles brewing, began to ripple through Medina. And with those ripples came even greater scrutiny. In times of peace, whispers are inconvenient. In times of war, they can be dangerous. People began asking themselves a question they had never asked before. If conflict comes, who will stand firm? And who will hesitate? That was the atmosphere Medina carried into the days leading up to its first great test. And as the tension climbed, the eyes that once looked at Abdullah with respect now watched him with something colder, something uncertain, waiting to see which direction he would lean when the situation turned from whispers to battle cries. In the weeks that followed those first uneasy whispers, Medina found itself holding its breath. Conflict with Quraysh was no longer a distant threat. It was close, real, and approaching fast. The city sensed it in the way messengers hurried through the streets, in the way conversations hushed when strangers passed by, and in the way the prophet quietly prepared his companions for something greater than self-defense. And while the people rallied with a mix of fear and determination, Abdullah ibn Ubayy watched everything unfold with an unease of his own. He wasn't opposed to protecting Medina, but he also wasn't ready for the kind of loyalty the prophet inspired, the kind that made men leave their homes with the calm certainty that faith would carry them farther than swords ever did. Abdullah knew strategy, diplomacy, alliances. He did not understand this new kind of courage. It unsettled him because he could not control it, could not predict it, and certainly could not match it. Then came Badr. News of the confrontation spread through Medina with the urgency of a beating drum. People waited for updates with anxious hearts. The odds were impossible. Just over 300 Muslims against nearly 1,000 of Quraysh's best fighters. Even the most steadfast believers wondered how such a small force could endure. Abdullah, hearing the numbers, expected defeat, not because he wished harm on the Muslims, but because he judged battles the way seasoned tribal leaders always had, by numbers, resources, and preparation. But Badr did not unfold according to any earthly calculation. When the first returning riders entered Medina with news of victory, the city erupted in a way it never had before. Cheers filled the streets. Families wept with joy. Children repeated the stories of angels descending to support the believers. The entire city felt lifted, lightened, transformed. Something divine had touched their lives, and the effect swept through the community like wind through open fields. And Abdullah? He stood in the middle of that celebration, feeling something tighten in his chest. He knew what this victory meant, not just militarily. though it was astonishing, but socially, spiritually, politically. The prophet had not only survived the confrontation, he had led a vastly outnumbered force to triumph. His status in Medina soared overnight. Even his quietest supporters walked taller. Even the skeptics found themselves shaken. People who once viewed the prophet as simply a respected guest began to see him as the rightful leader of their city. And the higher the prophet rose, the more Abdullah felt himself sinking. The victory at Badr did what no public speech or tribal pledge could have done. It united hearts behind one man with an intensity that no human effort could replicate. For Abdullah, who had spent years carefully weaving influence across Yathrib, watching it unravel so completely in a single moment was devastating. Every thread he had tied, every alliance he had nurtured, now seemed flimsy compared to the bond forged by shared faith and miraculous victory. He felt admiration, yes. Badr was extraordinary, but admiration coated in something darker. Jealousy, sharp and undeniable, crept through him. He had dreamed of uniting Yathrib. The prophet had actually done it, and with a single victory that Abdullah had played no part in. The city no longer looked to Abdullah for guidance. It looked to him for acceptance, and that shift cut deep. In the days after Badr, Abdullah walked through Medina, noticing how people spoke differently, how they mentioned the prophet with reverence that surpassed anything they had ever shown him, how the social gatherings he once dominated now revolved around recounting the battle, praising the bravery of men he had never thought would become heroes. His own role in the city's future grew smaller, not by force, but by the sheer magnetism of the prophet's success. Yet jealousy rarely sits quietly. It searches for company, for reassurance, for any outlet that dulls the sting of feeling replaced. And as Badr's triumph reshaped Medina's loyalties, Abdullah found himself drifting toward people who shared his discomfort, people who whispered more boldly now, who questioned the shifting power dynamics, who wondered aloud where they fit in a world where faith, not tribe, determined allegiance. These were not yet enemies, not yet rebels, but they were the first to offer Abdullah something he desperately needed, the feeling that he was still relevant. And through their whispered conversations, their discreet complaints, and their small pockets of resistance, Abdullah began forming connections that would soon test his judgment and open the door to alliances he never would have considered in a different world. In the days following the victory at Badr, Medina felt like a city reborn. Spirits were high, hopes were strong, and loyalties were deepening in ways that left some people standing at the center of the celebration and others standing just outside it. Abdullah ibn Ubayy found himself among the latter. Each cheer for the prophet, each retelling of the miraculous battle, each boast from someone who had barely held a sword before Badr reminded him that the city he once expected to lead was slipping further and further from his grasp. He wasn't blind to reality. He could see the direction things were moving. But he also wasn't ready to surrender the influence he'd built over decades. And in that growing discomfort, his mind turned toward the old alliances he'd once relied on. Relationships that predated Islam. Relationships he believed could still help him regain equilibrium in a world shifting too quickly. Medina wasn't composed solely of Aws and Khazraj. Several Jewish tribes lived within the city, or more accurately, alongside it, with their own internal structures, agreements, and histories. Some of them, particularly the leaders, had long-standing ties with Abdullah. They respected his authority, trusted his judgment, and in the pre-Hijra era had seen him as a potential stabilizing figure. They had once expected him to become the king of Yathrib, the man who could preserve fragile tribal balances while mediating disputes across communities. And for a moment, Abdullah wondered whether those ties could be revived. Not through rebellion. He wasn't ready to burn everything down, but through political strategy, through conversations, through reminders that leadership wasn't something to be swept aside by a single battle, no matter how miraculous. He believed that if he could strengthen those old connections, he might regain the leverage he felt slipping away. The problem, of course, was that Medina was no longer the same city. The Constitution of Medina had unified Muslims and Jewish tribes under a mutual protection pact. Alliances were no longer tribal conveniences. They were part of a broader communal structure. The prophet wasn't simply a spiritual leader. He had become the mediator, the one everyone looked to when disputes arose. And the Jewish tribes, even those who appreciated Abdullah, were not oblivious to the new power dynamics. Aligning too closely with a man losing influence could be risky, even unwise. Still, conversations happened. Quiet ones, polite ones that carried an undertone of things are different now, but also a subtle acknowledgement that Abdullah was searching for footing. Some leaders offered sympathy, others offered understanding, but none offered the kind of unwavering support he hoped for. The city had shifted, and although they respected Abdullah's past, they were not positioned to help him reclaim the role he believed had been taken from him. The more these talks fizzled, the more Abdullah felt the sting of isolation. He had counted on old loyalties to reinforce his authority. Instead, those loyalties reminded him that everyone, absolutely everyone, was adjusting to a new order. And in this new order, influence didn't come from past promises or political maneuvering. It came from faith, trust, and the undeniable moral gravity of the prophet. That realization hurt. It narrowed Abdullah's options and intensified the gnawing sense that he was a man out of place in his own city. The pressure building inside him wasn't yet explosive, but it was heavy enough to darken his thoughts. And then came the rising tension with Quraysh again. Rumors, threats, the unmistakable scent of another confrontation drifting into the city like a sandstorm warning. People braced themselves for war. Families grew serious. Markets quieted. The prophet prepared the believers with the calm resolve that had defined him since his arrival. Abdullah felt the weight of the moment. Another battle meant another test of loyalty, one that would be far more visible than whispers in private rooms. And as the preparations for Uhud began, he faced a decision that would mark the first openly public crack in his complicated relationship with the new leadership of Medina. A decision that would no longer be hidden behind quiet alliances or cautious conversations, but displayed before the entire city. The tension around Medina thickened as word spread that Quraysh was marching toward the city. This time, the threat felt different. Badr had given the Muslims confidence, but it had also given Quraysh a wound they were desperate to avenge. As the prophet consulted his companions, voices rose with different strategies, some urging to stay within Medina's defenses, others insisting they march out and meet the enemy in open field. Through all of this, Abdullah ibn Ubayy watched, listened, and quietly disagreed. He preferred the defensive approach. It was logical, strategic, rooted in the traditional ways Yathrib had protected itself long before Islam reshaped its identity. He voiced his opinion, but the younger companions, bolstered by the victory at Badr, leaned passionately toward open confrontation. The Prophet Talman, after listening to both sides, agreed to meet the enemy outside Medina, and though he later prepared to reconsider, the enthusiasm of the believers held firm. For Abdullah, this was a moment that felt painfully symbolic. His advice, once sought after, now felt like just another voice in the room. And when his counsel was ultimately not the chosen path, something rigid inside him tightened. It wasn't simply that he disagreed with the strategy, it was that he felt overshadowed once again. His experience weighed and quietly set aside. Still, he marched with the army. 300 of his supporters walked behind him, not because they were certain of his judgment, but because loyalties in Medina had not yet fully transformed. Some followed him out of habit, others out of tribal obligation, still others because they shared his doubts about the upcoming battle. And as they walked toward Uhud, that mixture of pride, worry, and suppressed resentment churned inside Abdullah like a storm waiting for release. When the army stopped to reassess the situation near Uhud, Abdullah spoke up again. His voice was calm, measured, but unmistakably firm. He believed the Prophet had been pressured into a strategy he did not fully endorse. He believed the younger companions had pushed for glory instead of safety. He believed the Muslims were marching toward unnecessary danger. Whether or not these thoughts were fair, they were real to him. And in that moment, pride and fear intertwined so tightly that untangling them became impossible. Then, with a tone that carried more resignation than anger, Abdullah made his fateful choice. He announced he would not continue. He turned away from the Prophet, and 300 men followed him. The moment felt heavy even before its consequences unfolded. Those who stayed behind watched the departing group with disbelief. The ones walking away felt the sting of separation, a sting that deepened with every step. It wasn't treachery in Abdullah's mind. It was strategy, an attempt to protect his tribe from what he believed was an avoidable catastrophe. But mixed into that was a deeper ache, the unspoken belief that the Prophet had disregarded him once too often. The departure was not loud or chaotic. It was quiet, orderly, and chillingly symbolic. The message it sent to the rest of Medina wasn't one of rebellion, but of deep fracture. And fractures, once exposed, spread quickly. The Muslim army fought on without them. The battle at Uhud unfolded with tragedy and resilience, shaping the emotional landscape of Medina for months to come. But for Abdullah, the real consequences began long before the outcome reached the city. As he returned with his men, he felt the eyes of Medina on him, some confused, some disappointed, some quietly furious. People whispered. They questioned his motives, his loyalty, his timing. Even those who sympathized with his strategy struggled to defend his timing. And as news of the battle's bitter outcome filtered back to the city, those whispers sharpened. Abdullah had walked away, but the consequences walked right behind him, waiting to greet him at every corner of Medina. The walk back to Medina after Uhud was short in distance, but impossibly long in wait. Every step Abdullah ibn Ubayy took stirred questions. Questions he wasn't ready to answer, and explanations no one seemed eager to hear. Word always travels faster than men, and by the time he approached the familiar streets of the city, many already knew what had happened. They knew he had turned back. They knew he had taken 300 men with him, and they knew the Muslims had suffered deeply that day. For a community that was still forming its identity, loyalty suddenly mattered more than anything. People greeted him not with hostility, but with an icy kind of distance. The ones who once nodded respectfully now turned away. Those who previously sought his counsel avoided meeting his eyes. Even his own clan, who had always stood behind him out of inherited loyalty, seemed unsure how to position themselves. They didn't wholly abandon him, but their support dimmed, flickering like a lamp running low on oil. The hardest reactions came quietly. A mother who had lost her son at Uhud stood outside her home as Abdullah passed by. She didn't shout, she didn't curse. She simply shook her head in a slow, painful motion that said everything her voice couldn't carry. And that silent grief carved itself into him more deeply than any insult could. Children whispered, young men muttered. The elders who once treated Abdullah as the natural leader of Yathrib now measured their words carefully around him, as though he were someone who might break or lash out. He wasn't given the dignity of confrontation or debate. He was given distance. Cold, unmistakable distance. His name began to shift in the city's vocabulary. It had once stood for diplomacy, for stability, for the possibility of unifying a fractured city. Now, it hovered near words like unreliability, hesitation, and heartbreak. People didn't call him a traitor. They didn't need to. The implication clung to him like dust that no amount of washing could remove. And Abdullah tried, truly tried, to justify his choice. He told friends and supporters that he had acted strategically, that staying within the city walls had been wiser, that he had been thinking of the safety of the people, that the prophet had been pressured. There was some truth in those words, but they were mixed with pride, fear, and wounds he wasn't willing to acknowledge openly. But explanations rarely matter when grief is fresh, and Medina was grieving deeply. Even the prophet, in his calm and compassionate way, made no move to humiliate Abdullah. He issued no punishment, no public rebuke. Yet the lack of confrontation somehow made it worse. Had there been a heated exchange, Abdullah might have felt justified in defending himself. Instead, the prophet's silent endurance exposed the smallness of Abdullah's decision in a way that stung far more than anger would have. The women of Medina spoke in hushed voices about how the battle unfolded. The young warriors retold the moment of confusion when the archers left their posts. Emotions ran raw through the city, and because Abdullah had walked away before any of that unfolded, every retelling seemed to place him further from the community's heart. Public shame settled over him like a heavy cloak, a cloak he did not choose, but one he could not remove, and slowly something inside him hardened. Shame doesn't always lead to humility. Sometimes it leads to defensiveness, to bitterness, to the desperate need to reassert one's importance in any way possible. Abdullah felt himself drifting toward that path, half in anger, half in self-preservation. He convinced himself that the people had misunderstood him, that he had been forced into the shadows by a community too caught up in faith and emotion to listen to reason. But the truth was simpler. The city had moved forward, and he was still standing where he had always been. That gap between a growing community and a man who feared becoming irrelevant was where Abdullah's frustration began to sharpen. And frustration, when mixed with pride, can push a man toward choices he never imagined making. Choices that would soon lead him into even more complicated moments, moments that would deepen the cracks already forming around him. The days after Uhud unfolded like a long gray stretch of sky, heavy, silent, and unsettled. Abdullah ibn Ubayy walked through Medina, feeling the air shift around him, thick with unspoken judgment and carefully measured politeness. The city didn't banish him, didn't confront him, didn't erupt in accusation. Instead, it turned him into a ghost that everyone could see, but no one truly engaged. And for a man who once expected to be its leader, that quietness felt far more painful than open condemnation. So he retreated into the places where his voice still held weight. Small gatherings, familiar courtyards, private conversations with people who still saw him not as a failed commander, but as the man who, in another world, might have worn a crown. It was in these spaces, shadowed, discreet, half hidden from the pulse of Medina's growing unity, that Abdullah began to speak more freely. He didn't sit down one day and decide to sow division. It wasn't a deliberate campaign. It was a series of small reactions, each shaped by pride, wounded dignity, and the desperate instinct to feel relevant again. A sigh after hearing someone praise the Prophet. A disappointed shake of the head when a young man discussed the direction Medina was moving. A murmured comment like, "Things were simpler before all this," spoken just loudly enough for someone to hear. These weren't accusations, but they were seeds. And seeds, once scattered, rarely stay where they're dropped. People listened, not because they agreed, but because humans always listen to doubt, especially when they're still recovering from loss. A few of his old supporters nodded sympathetically. Others repeated his phrases later, mixing them with their own interpretations. A simple comment became a whispered theory. A theory became a rumor. A rumor stretched into something larger, something exaggerated, something dangerous. Abdullah watched these ripples forming and didn't stop them. In fact, he began shaping them more carefully. He pointed out that some families felt overlooked. He suggested that the Muslims from Mecca were gaining influence too quickly. He framed his concerns as reflections, as observations, as attempts to balance things. But behind his measured tone lingered the sharp sting of resentment. The irony was that his efforts didn't strengthen his influence. They weakened it even more. Medina was not the fractured city it used to be. Faith had woven people together in ways politics never could. The more Abdullah tried to create small cracks in that unity, the more obvious his intentions became. Friends who once aligned with him began pulling away. Some refused to engage in his private discussions. Others walked away mid-conversation, sensing the direction his words were taking. He misread silence as agreement. He misread politeness as loyalty. Every time he whispered doubt, someone else countered it with conviction. Every time he suggested a subtle criticism, someone quietly defended the Prophet. The city was changing, maturing, growing. Spiritually, And Abdullah, standing in its shadow, was beginning to look like a relic of an age that was fading. But even as his efforts faltered, he continued, not because he believed he could still reclaim leadership, but because frustration had become a habit. The more he felt ignored, the more he sought out places where he could still feel heard. The more the community grew together, the more he felt compelled to create little fissures, anything to slow the momentum that was leaving him behind. In these quiet circles, he found people who were vulnerable to doubt. Individuals who felt insecure, who had personal grievances, who struggled with the rapid changes Islam brought. They weren't motivated by malice. They were simply unsettled, and Abdullah's presence gave them someone to echo, someone whose words gave form to feelings they didn't yet understand. But whispers have a lifespan. They either die in the shadows, or they grow loud enough to burst into the open. And soon, those whispers began drifting toward one of the most sensitive, most painful, most destabilizing scandals Medina would ever face. One where Abdullah's quiet criticisms would help ignite a storm far bigger than he intended. A scandal that would shake the entire community, wound innocent hearts, and expose just how dangerous it can be when frustration meets opportunity in the darkest corners of a city. The whispers had been drifting through Medina for months, harmless to some, irritating to others, but always present, always carried on the same currents of doubt that Abdullah ibn Ubayy kept alive in dim corners and quiet gatherings. Most of his murmurs faded into nothing. But then came the moment when a whisper found its target, a moment where a single rumor, born from malice and opportunity, attached itself to an innocent person and grew into a storm far too large for anyone to contain. It began after an expedition, when Aisha, R.A., the beloved wife of the Prophet Peace, became separated from the caravan and was later escorted back to Medina by Safwan ibn al-Mu'attal, a noble and trustworthy companion. Their return together should have stirred nothing more than concern and relief. But some hearts are trained to seek darkness where there is none, and some tongues are quick to turn coincidence into conspiracy. The first person to twist the story did so quietly, almost casually. But Abdullah, with his growing resentment and craving for influence, saw an opportunity in the scandal. An opportunity to stir unease, to reassert relevance, to poke at the unity that had left him behind. He let the rumor breathe. He repeated it in select gatherings, not as a bold accusation, but as a concerned observation. Strange, unsettling, unusual. Words that carried no direct blame, but planted seeds in receptive minds. And the seeds spread rapidly. Medina, despite its unity, was still a city of humans. Humans capable of jealousy, hurt, confusion, and fear. News of Aisha's delayed return invited questions, and questions turned into suspicions when fed by whispers from figures like Abdullah. His involvement wasn't loud, it wasn't public, but the rumor traveled on the wind he helped stir. The impact was devastating. Aisha, R.A., unaware at first, fell ill soon after returning. Her physical weakness made the emotional blow even harsher when the truth reached her. The Prophet, hurt, heartbroken, yet dignified, endured the pain of knowing people had dared to cast doubt on the purity of his household. The companions were shaken to their core. Families argued. Friends fell silent. The unity Medina had built, thread by thread, quivered under the weight of uncertainty. Everywhere the rumor traveled, hearts tightened. People who had stood strong through battles found themselves troubled by something far more insidious: doubt. It spread without swords, without armies, without warning. And at the center of its quiet storm, Abdullah moved through Medina with the satisfaction of a man whose whispers finally carried force again. But what he failed to anticipate was how deeply the incident would wound the community's spirit. This wasn't political. This wasn't about influence or strategy or tribal pride. This was about honor, about innocence, about trust. The slander didn't just shake the prophet, it shook every believer who loved Aisha, respected her, and saw her as a symbol of purity. And as the tension grew unbearable, revelation stopped coming through rumors and started descending from the heavens. The prophet waited with patience that only he possessed. Aisha waited with tears that only innocence could shed. And Medina waited with a collective breath held tight in its chest. Then the Quran spoke. Verses were revealed, clear and radiant, dissolving the fog of slander with the precision of divine truth. Aisha's innocence was declared unequivocally. The rumor mongers were condemned. The community was reminded that slander is a crime, not just against the victim, but against the very fabric of society. The effect was immediate. Hearts realigned, doubts evaporated. People who had carried the rumor felt shame rush into their faces, and those who had resisted it felt relief wash through their souls. But there was another effect, one quiet, heavy, and unmistakable. Everyone knew who had helped the rumor grow. Abdullah did not face legal punishment. He did not receive a public rebuke. But the revelation itself felt like a light shining directly into his shadows, exposing his role without needing to name him. His influence shrank further. His respect eroded. His bitterness deepened. And the city, shaken by the scandal and steadied again by revelation, moved forward with clarity. Yet for Abdullah, the exposure of this slander marked a turning point, a moment where divine truth did what politics had not. It placed him in stark, humiliating contrast against the values Medina now lived by, and, with that humiliation pressing on him like a weight he couldn't set down, he stepped into the next chapter of his life, one where every action would feel watched, and every whisper would echo louder than he intended. Revelation does many things. Sometimes it comforts. Sometimes it teaches. Sometimes it illuminates what the heart already knows. But on rare occasions, it does something far more piercing. It draws a line through the fog of human behavior so clearly that everyone who has contributed to the fog suddenly finds themselves standing exposed in the light. When the verses clearing Aisha's name descended, Medina exhaled as though it had been holding its breath for weeks. Homes filled with relief. Families softened back into calm. The prophet stood with a renewed sense of peace, his household restored. But while the believers rejoiced, others felt a different kind of weight settle onto their shoulders, one made not of guilt, but of recognition. They understood that these verses were not simply about clearing the innocent. They were about confronting the guilty, And among those who felt that weight most acutely was Abdullah ibn Ubayy. The Quran did not mention him by name. It didn't need to. The community knew who had fed the rumor, who had whispered with too much eagerness, who had repeated doubts that should never have been spoken aloud. The verses condemned slander as a crime against society, a wound inflicted not just on individuals, but on the very threads that hold communities together. It warned against those who loved that indecency should be spread among the believers. It reminded everyone that false accusations carry consequences before God. Each verse echoed through Medina like a quiet thunder, soft enough for the innocent to feel comforted, loud enough for the guilty to feel struck. For Abdullah, hearing those verses was like standing in a crowd where no one points directly at you, yet everyone knows the message was meant for your ears. It wasn't public shaming. It was something more profound, divine correction. And that kind of correction lingers far longer than human anger ever could. He kept his expression composed, of course. He always did. He blended into the listeners, nodding gently, brows furrowed as if contemplating the moral weight of slander like everyone else. But inside, something twisted sharply, uncomfortably. The revelation hadn't just condemned an act, it had revealed who he was becoming, or maybe who he had been for a long time. What stung most wasn't the exposure. It was the fact that revelation didn't even need to name him to make him feel accused. If a person is innocent, unnamed warnings wash over them without sticking. But for someone who has participated in wrongdoing, especially wrongdoing fueled by pride and resentment, those warnings cling to the ribs, cling to the mind, cling to the conscience in ways that cannot be ignored. After the verses spread through Medina, people didn't approach Abdullah directly. They didn't confront him. They didn't demand apologies. The silence was heavier than confrontation would have been. People simply became more cautious around him. A step backward in conversation. A shorter greeting. A glance that flickered with question rather than trust. Abdullah sensed each shift. He felt the way conversations stiffened when he joined a gathering. He noticed the way certain individuals avoided discussing the scandal in his presence, as though afraid he might twist their words again. He felt the distance growing, not in the loud ways he feared, but in the soft ways he despised. It was humiliation wrapped in subtlety. And humiliation, especially when born from divine revelation, settles deeper than any earthly embarrassment. Still, he told himself he could navigate it, that it would pass, that people would forget. But the verses had planted something far more durable than rumor, an awareness, a clarity that lingered in every believer's mind. Abdullah found himself becoming increasingly defensive, though he never expressed it openly. His thoughts grew sharper, his suspicions heavier. He wondered who had repeated his words, who had betrayed his confidence, who had brought the rumor to the prophet's attention. He began scanning faces not for friendship, but for clues. Paranoia is a slow-burning fire. It starts small, almost invisible, but once it catches, it spreads through the mind with frightening ease. And as the weight of revelation pressed down on him, Abdullah felt the first sparks of that fire, quiet, growing, and ready to reshape the way he saw every conversation, every glance, every whisper in the city he once believed he could rule. There is a strange tension that settles over a person when they begin to believe that their private thoughts are no longer private, that their intentions, however carefully hidden, are somehow visible to forces far beyond human perception. For Abdullah ibn Ubayy, the revelation surrounding the slander didn't just expose his role in the community's pain, it left him with an unsettling, lingering feeling that heaven itself was aware of his motives, his frustrations, his quiet manipulations. And once a man begins to feel watched from above, every step he takes begins to feel heavier than the one before it. He walked through Medina with the same careful composure he had always displayed, but the sensation of being under a divine spotlight followed him everywhere. When he entered the mosque, he felt as though eyes were on him, not accusing, but knowing. When he passed by the companions who had witnessed the revelations firsthand, he sensed something unspoken in the air, a kind of silent understanding that extended beyond human knowledge. Even when he sat alone, his own thoughts felt as though they echoed more loudly than before. It wasn't paranoia in the ordinary sense. It was the realization that the old rules he had relied on, political maneuvering, subtle influence, strategic whispers, had no power in a world where truth could descend from the heavens at any moment. The very tools that once made him a skilled leader now felt flimsy, almost childish, when contrasted with the weight of divine revelation. Still, he tried to maintain the illusion of normalcy. He continued attending gatherings, offering advice, pretending as though nothing had changed. But every time he opened his mouth, he wondered if the wrong sentence might bring down another verse that exposed him. Every whisper felt dangerous. Every complaint felt like a risk. The shadows he once used to protect himself now felt illuminated by something he could neither challenge nor predict. This made his movements more calculated than ever before. He chose his words with excruciating care. He watched people for any sign that they might be reporting back to the prophet. Every brief conversation felt layered, like a negotiation for social survival. His pride would not let him withdraw completely. He refused to become irrelevant, but the fear of slipping again made every step cautious and tense. And while people did not openly confront him, the quiet shift in how they interacted with him made the internal pressure worse. Respectful greetings were shorter. Conversations ended sooner. Invitations to decision-making circles became less frequent. Abdullah sensed that the community was not excluding him intentionally. Rather, they had simply outgrown him. The foundation of unity was now built on faith, not politics, on sincerity, not strategy, on trust, not tribal leverage. And he, a man of influence, shaped in the pre-Islamic world, could not keep pace. He felt like a relic, one still shaped like a leader, but no longer needed as one. Every afternoon carried a strange duality. Part of him felt threatened by the divine awareness he sensed hovering above his actions. Another part of him felt angry that the world around him had changed so dramatically, and that revelation seemed to shine light on his flaws rather than the contributions he believed he had once made. He wondered if every misstep, every slight misjudgment would be exposed next, and that fear made his resentment simmer beneath his skin. And in the middle of this psychological storm, Medina was preparing for something far larger than personal drama. Threats from surrounding tribes grew louder, Rumors of siege and attack spread through the city. The community began gathering resources, strengthening defenses, readying itself for a confrontation unlike any before. The Battle of the Trench was approaching, a moment that would put every heart in Medina to the test, believer and doubter alike. And for Abdullah, living under the weight of divine scrutiny, it would become yet another stage where his internal conflict, his pride, and his fear collided in ways he could no longer control. The threat hanging over Medina grew heavier by the day. News traveled fast. A coalition of tribes, vast, determined, united by their resentment of the Muslims, was marching toward the city. This wasn't a skirmish or a raid. This was an attempt to wipe Medina off the map entirely. And in the face of a danger so overwhelming, the Prophet proposed a strategy no one had considered before: digging a massive trench along the exposed northern side of the city. It was an idea from Salman al-Farisi, a brilliant adaptation of tactics used in Persia. Not everyone understood it at first, but the moment they began digging, its necessity became obvious. The community threw itself into the effort. Muslims from Mecca and Medina, young boys eager to help, elders who insisted on lifting even when their backs protested. They worked through cold winds and long nights. Their hands blistered. Their stomachs ached from hunger. But their spirits remained firm. And in the middle of all this movement, all this striving, all this unity, stood Abdullah ibn Ubayy. Or rather, he didn't stand, he lingered, present but not participating, watching but not committing. His presence at the trench was like a shadow, there but not contributing warmth or support. He offered no advice to the planners, no strength to the diggers, no encouragement to those whose arms trembled with fatigue. He merely appeared at intervals, observing the effort with the detached expression of someone who had already emotionally withdrawn from the community's fate. People noticed. They noticed the absence of sweat on his brow. They noticed that he never picked up a tool. They noticed the way he stood at the edges of the trench, as though the labor beneath him was beneath him as well. Leadership was not just about words, especially in Medina. Not anymore. It was about standing shoulder to shoulder in moments of hardship. And here, in one of the most crucial moments the city had ever faced, Abdullah's silence felt less like neutrality and more like abandonment. Even those who once sympathized with him found it hard to defend his inaction. The younger men, whose faith burned bright, watched him with confusion. They had grown up hearing stories of leaders who fought alongside their people, who stood in the mud and dust and danger without hesitation. Abdullah did none of that. He offered nods of recognition, yes, a few clipped phrases of approval, but never the kind of help that would stain his robe or bruise his hands. His assistants worked only half-heartedly, mirroring his detachment. They dug a little, stopped often, and seemed to wait for cues that never came. Abdullah himself drifted from group to group, sometimes stopping to comment on minor organizational issues, rarely helpful, mostly discouraging. The trench was not merely a military project. It was a symbol of collective courage, of faith meeting action. And the fact that Abdullah seemed unmoved by that symbol said more about his heart than any accusation could. Yet again, he felt that sensation, that tightening awareness that people were watching him. But this time, the feeling didn't come from divine revelation. It came from the quiet judgment of neighbors, from the subtle disappointment in their eyes, from the lack of warmth in their greetings as the days passed. He was not being publicly rebuked or shamed, but the community was silently recording his choices, and Abdullah could sense that these records were not in his favor. His silence during the trench effort wasn't just a lack of action. It was a statement, one that communicated, intentionally or not, that he didn't see the threat as his problem. Or worse, that he didn't see the Muslim's survival as essential to his future. And this silence pushed him further into isolation. The more he withdrew, the less anyone sought his opinion. The less he helped, the more people turned their backs. He had always feared becoming irrelevant, but now he was hastening that irrelevance through every quiet refusal. Yet instead of correcting course, Abdullah felt irritation simmering. Irritation at the expectations placed on him. Irritation at the community's unity. Irritation at the realization that the trench was succeeding, that the Muslims were growing stronger through hardship, not weaker. And irritation, once it takes root in a prideful heart, often leads to action. It was during this time, lost in frustration, detached from the spirit of Medina, and watching his influence crumble grain by grain, that Abdullah stumbled into yet another misstep, one that would deepen the growing chasm between him and the people he had once expected to rule. When the trench finally served its purpose, and the great siege dissolved into wind and retreat, Medina felt as if it had undergone a spiritual rebirth. The enemy alliance, so confident, so enormous, so certain of victory, had broken apart without ever crossing the trench's edge. The city had survived not through might, but through steadfastness, unity, and an unshakable trust in the guidance of the Prophet. The believers emerged exhausted yet strengthened, bonded more tightly by the shared struggle and the miraculous deliverance they had witnessed. But while Medina grew stronger, Abdullah ibn Ubayy felt something inside himself wither. Victory should have brought him at least a measure of satisfaction, if only as a citizen whose home had been spared. But instead, he watched as the trench became a symbol of the community's resolve. A story retold at gatherings where every man, woman, and child celebrated what they had endured and overcome. And each telling made his absence more glaring. People now spoke proudly of those who had dug alongside the Prophet, of the chants they sang to keep their spirits alive, of the miraculous gusts of wind that tore through the enemy camps. Families shared stories of fathers who had worked through fever, sons who had carried sand until their shoulders bruised, companions who had protected the city with trembling but determined hearts. And in all these stories, Abdullah had no place. Even within his own clan, the Khazraj, whispers began to shift. For years, many had supported him out of habit, tradition, or tribal loyalty. But loyalty built on customs can erode when confronted with the passionate unity of faith. Younger members of his clan, inspired by the Prophet and the believers, began seeing Abdullah as a relic of the old system, not the leader of the new order. Older members, more cautious, found it harder to defend him when their sons were returning home with dirt still embedded under their nails, while Abdullah's hands remained unstained. Around campfires, in courtyards, at water wells, subtle exchanges revealed this shift. Leaders who once sought Abdullah's opinion now sought advice from companions of the Prophet. Mediators who once consulted him in disputes now turned to community members shaped by revelation and principle rather than tribal politics. Even those who still liked Abdullah personally found it difficult to justify his passivity in a time when everyone else had given so much. He felt the distance widening. It wasn't abrupt or hostile. It was gradual, steady, and unmistakably real. People no longer approached him with the instinctive respect they once held. Conversations grew shorter. Fewer people lingered to hear his thoughts. And what pained him most, he could feel the sincerity in the city had grown beyond him. While he had spent years building influence through negotiation and subtle leverage, Medina was now building itself on something far sturdier: faith, purpose, and independence from the old power structures he had mastered. Even casual gestures reminded him of what he was losing. A group of youths who once greeted him enthusiastically now offered polite, distant nods. A man he had helped in the past chose to consult someone else about a family dispute. At gatherings, he often found himself standing slightly apart from conversations, listening but rarely invited to speak. He interpreted these moments not as natural outcomes of social change, but as affronts, slights, betrayals, evidence that the community had conspired to sideline him. An isolation, when mixed with pride, becomes a bitter drink. Yet Abdullah wasn't ready to vanish. Not yet. The erosion of his influence frightened him too deeply. His life had been built on being listened to, respected, deferred to. To lose that meant losing the identity he had carried for decades. So as the city celebrated its survival and looked toward the future with renewed hope, Abdullah began planning ways to reassert himself. Small ways at first, then increasingly bold. He watched people carefully, noting grievances, noticing frustrations, seeking footholds where he might regain some authority. He reminded his supporters, quietly, of the old days, of the time when he was to become Yathrib's king, before fate and history shifted course. He tried to rally sympathy from those still lingering in his orbit. In his mind, he wasn't finished, not by a long stretch, and it was this restless desire to reclaim relevance, fueled by resentment and fear, that pushed him toward his next attempt, a decision that would reveal just how desperate he had become to hold on to the fading crown he had once imagined for himself. The gathering was meant to be routine, a community meeting to settle minor disputes, address shared concerns, and discuss the steady rebuilding after the siege. Medina had a rhythm to such gatherings now. People arrived with openness, spoke with honesty, and left with the sense that problems could be resolved without escalating into the old tribal feuds. It was the kind of meeting Abdullah ibn Ubayy once dominated with ease. In the days before Islam reshaped the city, his presence alone commanded attention. Silence followed when he raised his hand. Decisions bent when he voiced his preference. He remembered those days vividly, painfully. So when he stepped into the meeting space that afternoon, he did so with the posture of his former self. Shoulders back, expression calm, steps measured. He took a place near the front, as he always used to, expecting at least a ripple of acknowledgement. But the room did not shift to accommodate him. Conversations continued. People nodded politely but didn't rearrange themselves. Younger members of the Khazraj passed in front of him, without hesitation, settling near companions of the prophetess, eager to learn from their experience and integrity rather than the political savvy Abdullah had once prided himself on. He waited for the meeting to begin, convincing himself that once discussion started, his influence would naturally reassert itself. When a matter arose involving intertribal cooperation, exactly the kind of topic he used to control, Abdullah seized his moment. He stood, clearing his throat with authority, expecting the room to hush. It did, but not in the way he once knew. The silence was polite, curious, but devoid of deference. He launched into a speech about leadership, unity, and the importance of experienced voices guiding the community. His words were smooth, well-constructed, the kind of speech that would have impressed years earlier. But something was off. People listened, yes, but their eyes drifted. Their bodies shifted. The enthusiasm he expected to ignite remained cold. Then, as he continued, a young man from his own clan, someone Abdullah remembered as a quiet child who once looked up to him, raised a hand and gently challenged him. Respectfully, calmly, but firmly. He spoke about how unity wasn't merely about seniority or past influence. It was now grounded in faith, sincerity, and shared sacrifice. Others nodded. The point landed. Abdullah felt the ground shift beneath him. He attempted to respond, but another young man, another from the Khazraj, added a comment reinforcing the first. They weren't attacking him, but they were undermining him, effortlessly, without fear or hesitation. Their words carried a tone Abdullah had never associated with his clan before. Independence. He felt heat rising in his face. Not anger exactly, something more dangerous. A mixture of humiliation and disbelief. He tried to redirect the conversation, but the meeting's attention had already moved on. Someone asked a companion of the prophet for guidance. Someone else built on that advice. Voices layered over one another, respectful and focused, but leaving Abdullah completely outside the flow of the discussion. He stood there for a few breaths longer, then quietly sat down. No one mocked him. No one rebuked him. The absence of hostility should have comforted him, but instead, it felt like a confirmation of his irrelevance. The meeting ended with warm exchanges, plans set in motion, people dispersing with purpose. Abdullah remained seated for a long moment, trying to process what had just happened. He wasn't used to being overshadowed. He wasn't used to being ignored. But today, he had been both. As he finally stood and left the gathering place, he overheard a small group discussing something in hushed tones. Nothing loud, nothing confrontational, but impossible to ignore. Someone said, if only he would leave Medina, it would end so many problems. The words froze him mid-step. Expulsion. The idea wasn't new. Certain companions had suggested it before, especially after Uhud and the scandal of the slander. The prophet had always rejected it, refusing to uproot a man so deeply tied to his tribe and to the city's fragile social web. But hearing the conversation from members of his own clan, people who had once stood behind him unconditionally, was a revelation far more painful than any verse. The rift between Abdullah and Medina wasn't just growing, it was becoming a chasm. And in that widening distance, the dangerous idea of expulsion found new life, setting the stage for one of the most humiliating moments he would ever face. The dust of humiliation from the failed meeting still clung to Abdullah ibn Ubayy when he walked away that day. His pride, already battered by years of diminishing influence, now felt stretched thin, like a thread pulled tight enough to snap with the slightest tug. And Medina, in its unity and new certainty, no longer offered him the comforting illusions he used to wrap around himself. Everywhere he looked, he saw signs that the world he once expected to rule had slipped entirely out of his grasp. So, when tensions rose again during an expedition involving the Prophet and his companions, Abdullah arrived carrying the weight of every slight, every whispered criticism, every moment he had been overshadowed. His heart was raw, and raw hearts rarely choose their words wisely. During the return journey to Medina, a dispute broke out between a muhajir, one of the Muslims who had migrated from Mecca, and a young Ansari from Medina. Harsh words were exchanged, tempers flared, and what should have been a small disagreement ballooned into a tense moment between two groups who had worked so hard to build solidarity. People gathered quickly. Voices rose. Old tribal instincts flickered like dying embers suddenly caught by a stray breeze. In this heated atmosphere, Abdullah saw an opportunity, not to unify, not to calm, but to assert himself. For a moment, he felt the old pulse of leadership surge through him, reminding him of the man he once believed he was destined to become. He leaned toward his supporters, few now, but loyal enough, and spoke with a bitterness that had been building for years. In a voice sharp with resentment, he uttered the line that would echo through Medina long after the dust settled. If we return to Medina, the most honorable will surely expel the meanest. It was a sentence sharpened with pride and layered with implication. He positioned himself, the honorable, against the Prophet and his followers, the meanest. It wasn't merely an insult. It was an inversion of reality, a statement forged from wounded ego and festering frustration. To him, the words felt like a reclaiming of status. To those who heard them, they sounded like betrayal. The remark traveled quickly, far faster than he intended. What he had meant for a private venting became public knowledge within hours. Conversations in Medina buzzed with disbelief. Young men who had once respected him shook their heads in disappointment. Elderly women, who had seen the city through two eras, whispered prayers that God would protect the community from division. Even his closest allies struggled to defend him, their loyalty strained by the sheer audacity of the statement. And Abdullah knew, the moment he stepped back into his home, that he had gone too far. But words cannot be retrieved once released into the world. The most painful part was that the statement reached the ears of the Prophet, not through gossip, but through direct testimony from those who had heard it. And alongside the Prophet stood someone who took the insult personally, not just as a believer, but as a son. Abdullah ibn Abdullah, the son of Abdullah ibn Ubayy, was a devout Muslim, known for his sincerity and unwavering support of the Prophet. Where his father's pride clouded his judgment, the son's humility sharpened his devotion. And when he heard what his own father had said, that venomous line separating honorable from mean, something inside him tightened. He loved his father, but he loved the truth more. The emotional fallout rippled through both men. one clinging to pride like a shield, the other torn between familial loyalty and faith. The tension between father and son grew like a storm cloud gathering weight, ready to break open the next time they stood face to face. And that confrontation was coming soon. More direct, more painful, and more revealing than anything Abdullah had faced before. The road back to Medina should have been familiar to Abdullah ibn Ubayy, a path he had walked countless times, once with the confidence of a man who believed the city belonged to him. But on this day, as he approached the gates, the air felt heavier, the shadows longer, and the murmurs around him sharper with meaning he could no longer ignore. Word of his infamous statement had spread swiftly, weaving through the community like a cold wind. And now, every step closer to the city felt like approaching a reckoning he had not prepared for. He expected disapproval. He expected whispers. What he did not expect was to see his own son standing at the entrance, blocking the path. Abdullah ibn Abdullah, calm, steadfast, fiercely loyal to the Prophet, stood tall, with a group of young men beside him, men whose faces carried a mix of respect and firm resolve. His posture was not confrontational, but it was unyielding. For a brief moment, the older Abdullah felt confusion wash over him. Was this some misunderstanding? A misplaced greeting? But his son's expression made the truth unmistakable. He wasn't there to welcome his father home. He was there to stop him. The space between them tightened with unspoken tension. The father looked into the eyes of the son he had raised, eyes that once held admiration, now filled with something far more painful: duty. "By Allah," the young man said, his voice steady, "you will not enter Medina until the messenger of Allah permits you, or until you acknowledge that you are the one who is the meanest, not he." The words struck like a physical blow, not because of their harshness, there was none, not because of their disrespect. His son spoke with deep sorrow, not rebellion. It was the truth behind them, the truth Abdullah had spent years avoiding, that made them burn. The father's eyes widened, not in anger, but in disbelief. Humiliation washed over him, hot and suffocating. To be confronted publicly was painful enough, but to be confronted by his own son, the boy who had once trailed behind him with admiration, who had once believed his father could unite Yathrib, this pierced a place deeper than pride. People gathered nearby, drawn by the unexpected sight. Some watched in silence, some in sympathy, some in stern approval, but none interfered. This was not a tribal dispute or a political quarrel. This was a test of loyalty. One family torn between old allegiance and new truth. The young Abdullah stood unwavering, his loyalty to the Prophet stronger than blood. The father felt the weight of every choice he had made, every whisper he had shared, every moment he had chosen his pride over unity. And now, those choices had brought him to this moment, where even his children were no longer shielded from the consequences of his actions. Attempts to argue rose in his throat, but his son's firm expression silenced them. The humiliation deepened. Standing before an audience he never wanted, trapped between his past self and the city that had moved on without him, Abdullah realized that the world had changed in ways he could never reverse. His influence had slipped beyond his grasp. Now, even his familial authority was dissolving. He stood there, breathing heavily, struggling to hold on to what little dignity he felt remained. But dignity without power, without respect, without moral grounding, what was it really worth? Eventually, word reached the prophet Daus, who, with his characteristic mercy, instructed the young man to let his father enter without forcing an apology. The prophet understood the delicate balance of family pain and public shame, and he refused to let humiliation become punishment. But even after being permitted inside, the wound remained. The walk back into Medina felt nothing like the countless times before. The gate behind him felt like a dividing line, the barrier between the father he had been and the increasingly isolated man he was becoming. Inside his home, surrounded by familiar walls, Abdullah sat in silence, replaying the confrontation again and again. His son's unwavering loyalty to the prophet was a reflection not of rebellion, but of conviction. Conviction that Abdullah himself could no longer understand. That night, he wasn't angry. He wasn't resentful. He was unsettled, shaken. Something inside him, a mixture of pride, identity, and certainty, had cracked. And cracks, when deep enough, begin to reshape everything around them. His mental state, already strained by years of diminishing influence, now slipped into something heavier, something darker, something that would follow him into the chapters ahead, where regret, fear, and the fading of relevance converged into a burden he could no longer hide. The days after the confrontation at Medina's gate passed like a slow descent into a deeper, more private darkness. Abdullah ibn Ubayy had endured public embarrassment before. Whispers after Uhud, cold glances during the slander incident, quiet judgment during the trench. But being stopped by his own son, that was a wound that didn't scab over. It stayed raw. It pressed against every thought he tried to gather. It replayed whenever he closed his eyes. And slowly, something inside him began to sour in a way that felt irreversible. Pride had always been his armor. Even when he lost influence, he told himself that he still held dignity, wisdom, and the ability to sway people when necessary. But now, that pride no longer protected him. It poisoned him, turned every memory into a grievance, every conversation into an insult, every silence into a threat. He started withdrawing from the community, not dramatically, not in a way that drew attention. Instead, little by little, he skipped gatherings he once attended. He avoided wells at times he knew they would be crowded. He took longer routes through Medina to avoid passing by the mosque, where he felt the weight of too many unspoken expectations. Men who once stood by him sensed the shift and drifted away, choosing the calm certainty of the prophet's guidance over the bitterness forming around Abdullah like a storm cloud. His world shrank. Even inside his home, the air grew tense. His children respected him, yes, but they respected something else far more now. The truth. Faith had rewritten their loyalties, their ambitions, their sense of identity. They still loved him, still served him, still honored his rights as their father, but he no longer inspired them. That realization stung him more deeply than any public humiliation. And so, the bitterness grew. He found himself lying awake at night, replaying years of disappointment, how he had been poised to become Yathrib's leader, how Islam had unified the city in ways he had once attempted but never achieved, how the prophet had become everything Abdullah wished he had been: respected, trusted, loved. The comparison tore at him. He despised the feeling, despised himself for feeling it, yet couldn't escape it. Anxiety followed bitterness. Paranoia came next. He began suspecting that every quiet conversation he passed was about him, that every glance was an accusation, that the prophet's companions watched him with judgment, waiting for him to slip again. He imagined his son reporting his words, imagined his tribe conspiring to replace him in ways they never would have dared before. The cracks in his confidence widened until they felt like open chasms. And yet, outwardly, he tried to hold on to the fragments of dignity he still had. He wore the same expressions, walked the same steady pace, offered the same polite greetings, but anyone paying attention could see the change. His shoulders sagged a little lower. His tone had lost its old conviction. His interactions felt rehearsed, empty, lacking the sharpness that once made him a formidable political figure. Only a small handful of followers, mostly men who clung to the old tribal structures, remained near him, but even they seemed reluctant, more out of habit than loyalty. Their conversations with him were short, lukewarm, hollow of the strategic brilliance that once characterized Abdullah's counsel. And when they left, they often exchanged glances that suggested worry more than admiration. Bitterness, when left to simmer, can twist a man's perception until he mistakes isolation for invisibility and invisibility for threat. Abdullah felt cornered by a world that no longer revolved around him, haunted by the idea that if he didn't act, he would be forgotten entirely. But the more he acted out of fear and resentment, the deeper he sank into that fear and resentment. It became a loop he could no longer break, and Medina was entering a new phase, one that would require even greater unity and sacrifice. Rumors spread that the prophet was preparing for an expedition to Tabuk, far to the north, one of the most challenging campaigns the Muslims would undertake. It would test loyalty, endurance, and sincerity on a scale Medina had never before experienced. For Abdullah ibn Ubayy, already drifting into paranoia, the upcoming expedition would become another moment where his internal turmoil collided with the expectations of a community moving steadily forward without him, pushing him toward yet another misstep he wouldn't be able to hide behind whispers or shadows. The announcement spread through Medina like a slow, heavy wind. The prophet was calling the community to march north, toward Tabuk. It was not a small journey. It was not a convenient one. It would be long, sweltering, exhausting, and expensive, undertaken in a season so scorching that even the dust seemed tired. The Romans were rumored to be mobilizing, and the Muslims needed to show strength, unity, and readiness. It was a test not just of courage, but of sincerity. And sincerity was the one thing Abdullah ibn Ubayy feared he could no longer convincingly display. When the call to Tabuk came, it triggered something deep inside him, a weariness that had accumulated bone deep over the years, and a fear he tried desperately to hide. He was not a young man. His pride had carried him through many things, but pride does little to lift tired limbs or calm a trembling heart. The journey would be brutal. The sun alone felt like an enemy one couldn't reason with. Yet, beyond physical discomfort, Abdullah feared something else far more: the vulnerability of being seen among those whose loyalty was unquestioned. Marching alongside the prophet meant being placed under a spotlight he was trying desperately to avoid. This wasn't a trench. where he could hide among passers-by and pretend his silence was enough. This was a march of faith, a journey marked by sweat, sincerity, and sacrifice. People would notice who stepped forward and who stepped back. And so began the subtle chorus of excuses, centered around Abdullah, but echoed by others whose hearts lacked conviction. They formed their own quiet circle, men who lingered near him out of habit or survival instinct. Their discussions were filled with reasons that sounded rational enough to the uncritical ear. It's too hot. The crops need tending. The distance is too great. The threat might be exaggerated. We can't leave our families unprotected. Abdullah didn't openly forbid anyone from going. He didn't criticize the Prophet directly. He simply cultivated reluctance. He allowed the hesitation of others to validate his own. He sat among them, nodding slowly, offering comments that sounded wise on the surface, but carried the unmistakable weight of evasion. "Perhaps this isn't the right time," he murmured. "Surely God does not burden us beyond our capacity. The Prophet has strong young men with him already. What difference will our presence make?" They were statements, crafted not to challenge faith, but to dilute it. And the men around him found comfort in his reasoning, not because it was sound, but because it provided shelter from guilt. Yet something was different now, compared to the early years. Before, his words guided people with ease. Now, some shifted uneasily, sensing the hollow echo behind his phrases. Some listened politely and then walked away to prepare for the expedition anyway. Others simply nodded without conviction. Abdullah could feel his influence slipping, even in the circle of hesitation he himself had gathered. He told himself it didn't matter, that he wasn't obligated to endure such hardship, that men with more enthusiasm and fewer years could take his place. But deep inside, he knew what the journey represented. He knew that refusing to join wasn't simply a matter of discomfort. It was a measure of sincerity. And sincerity was exactly what people doubted most about him. The day the army finally marched out, ranks shimmering under the merciless sun, Abdullah watched them leave with a bitter mixture of relief and regret. The dust they kicked up drifted toward him, settling on his clothes like a physical reminder of the journey he had avoided. For a man who once believed Yathrib would revolve around him, it was painful to watch the entire city move forward without so much as looking in his direction. While the believers endured heat, hunger, and miles of unforgiving terrain, Abdullah remained in Medina, sitting in the shade, surrounded by those who shared his reluctance. But the shade didn't bring him peace. The coolness didn't soothe him. Every returning messenger, every rumor of the Muslims' perseverance, only deepened his unease. He had not gone. They all knew it. He had missed a test the community would speak of for generations. And when the army returned, sunburned, exhausted, victorious not through battle, but through unwavering unity, Medina's air shifted again. This time, the shift was unmistakable. The believers had proven themselves. The hypocrites had exposed themselves. The lines between sincerity and pretense were clearer than ever. For Abdullah ibn Ubayy, the aftermath of Tabuk would not be a mere return to normal life. It would be the beginning of a humiliation far heavier than anything he had tasted before. One written not by gossip, nor by confrontation, but by the unmistakable contrast between those who stood firm and the one who chose to stay behind. The return of the prophet from Tabuk should have been a moment of collective relief for Medina. The long march was over, the agony of the desert behind them, and the Roman threat had dissolved before a single arrow flew. The people who had gone, sunburned, blistered, thirsty, returned not only with their bodies intact, but with a renewed sense of unity and purpose. There was joy in the streets, gratitude in the air, and a quiet pride in the hearts of those who had endured the trial. But for those who remained behind, the sound of the returning army was not comforting. It was terrifying. Abdullah ibn Ubayy stood among the men who had watched the expedition leave and now watched it return, the sun casting long shadows behind them. Although he tried to maintain a calm expression, something inside him tightened with every step the prophet took toward Medina. The believers returning home were not the same as when they had left. Hardship had refined them. Sincerity had defined them. And in contrast, those who had avoided the journey felt suddenly transparent, as if their excuses were thin veils no one believed anymore. As the army entered the city, those who had stayed behind lined up to offer explanations, some ridiculous, some predictable, some soaked in desperation. Men stumbled over their words, hoping to sound remorseful or justified. They avoided eye contact. Their voices trembled. And the prophet Tio, with his unmatched patience, listened to each one without harshness. He neither humiliated nor exposed. He simply accepted their words and left their sincerity, or lack thereof, to God. But Abdullah could feel a shift. When he approached with his practiced composure, offering excuses wrapped in politeness and elaborate reasoning, he watched the prophet listen without even the faintest sign of interest. Not annoyance, not anger, not disappointment, just neutrality. And that neutrality was devastating. For years, Abdullah had relied on nuance. He had shaped narratives with careful phrasing and well-timed comments, but now none of it mattered. Words no longer carried weight if the speaker had no credibility. And in the eyes of the community, Abdullah's credibility had drained away so quietly that even he hadn't noticed the exact moment it vanished. The companions standing nearby exchanged knowing glances, not mocking, but acknowledging what everyone had come to understand. Abdullah's excuses didn't matter. His presence didn't matter. His absence from Tabuk had simply revealed what faith had been revealing for years, that he stood apart, not with the believers, not with their unity, not with their purpose. Some of his old followers still lingered near him out of habit, but even they no longer defended him. Their silence pressed in on him more tightly than their words ever had. People who once looked to him for guidance barely spared him a greeting. It was a strange kind of humiliation. Not loud, not public, not theatrical. A soft collapse, a fading. The realization that he had been left behind, not because he refused to march, but because he no longer had a place in the story that was unfolding around him. And while he tried to tell himself that things would return to normal, Medina had already moved forward. The Tabuk expedition had been a line drawn in the sand, quite literally. Those who crossed it with the prophet were now united in a bond no words could replicate. Those who stayed behind were left with the crushing awareness of their own insincerity. But for Abdullah, the fallout didn't stop there. Not long after Tabuk, a peculiar project emerged on the outskirts of Medina, an alternative mosque built by a small group who claimed they merely wanted convenience, shade, a place of worship closer to home. They invited the Prophet to inaugurate it, praising its purpose with suspicious enthusiasm. And Abdullah watched with interest. A new center of influence, separate from the Prophet's mosque, a place where those dissatisfied with the main community could gather unnoticed. To a man whose authority had been hollowed out, the possibility glimmered like a faint spark in the ashes of his pride. Little did he know, this spark would ignite a narrative that would expose not only motives, but intentions, and reveal the dangerous allure of division disguised as devotion. The structure of Masjid al-Dirar was simple, just a modest building on the outskirts of Medina, unremarkable in appearance, the kind of place that could easily be mistaken for another small community center or prayer space. To the untrained eye, it was harmless. To those seeking an alternative to the Prophet's mosque, it was appealing. And to men who had long felt overshadowed or uncomfortable with the growing unity of the believers, it represented something subtle but deeply seductive, a chance to belong somewhere else. Abdullah ibn Ubayy did not build it. He didn't lay a single stone or draw a single plan. But the kind of minds attracted to its creation were the same ones who lingered around him, the ones who whispered resentments, who preferred division masked as independence, who mistook dissatisfaction for principle. They approached Abdullah, consulted him, and carried his frustrations into their ambitions. And whether he approved openly or simply failed to distance himself, the association formed quickly. This new structure, this mosque, was aligned with the spirit of hypocrisy that had been trailing him for years. Its founders spoke convincingly, of course. They claimed they only wanted a convenient place of prayer, something closer, something easier, something welcoming to those unable to reach the Prophet's mosque. Their words sounded pious enough. Their intentions, however, carried a quiet corrosion, and Abdullah saw in it something that stirred a faint, forgotten spark inside him, an opportunity to build influence again. A separate center could become a stage, a place where he might still matter, a place where his voice, so often ignored now, could echo again among people willing to listen. So he drifted near the project, not openly declaring leadership, but never rejecting the association. He allowed his presence to give it legitimacy among a few wavering hearts. And in doing so, he tied himself to something he didn't fully understand, something darker than political maneuvering, something that revelation would soon expose with terrifying clarity. When the Prophet returned from Tabuk, the builders approached him eagerly, inviting him to pray in their mosque as an inaugural blessing. Their smiles were wide, their enthusiasm rehearsed. They expected approval. They expected validation. What they received instead were verses, sharp, unflinching, illuminating everything they had tried to cloak. The Quran revealed the truth. The structure was not built for worship, but for harm. Not for unity, but for division. Not for sincerity, but for deceit. It was a masjid in appearance and a weapon in intention. A base of operations for those who opposed the community from within. The revelation named its purpose: to spread discord, to shelter enemies, to undermine the Prophet. The words struck Medina like a thunderclap, and in the silence that followed, all eyes turned, if not directly, then by implication, toward the circle most closely associated with it, toward men whose hypocrisy had grown too visible to ignore, toward the name that had hovered at the edges of division for years, Abdullah ibn Ubayy. The prophet ordered the building to be dismantled and burned. Men who had contributed to it lowered their heads in shame. The community felt a renewed clarity about sincerity and its opposite. And Abdullah, he felt something cold settle inside him, something heavy and undeniable. His reputation, which had been eroding grain by grain, now seemed to collapse in a single moment. He stood not as a rival, nor as a leader, nor even as a misguided elder. He stood as a cautionary example, a man whose political instincts had led him down paths that divine revelation exposed again and again. The Khazraj watched him with a mix of sorrow and resignation. They saw what he had become. They saw what he could have been. And they saw how the distance between those two realities had widened until there was no bridge left to cross. Among the younger men, disappointment deepened. Among the elders, quiet regret took root. Among his own household, the weight of association settled like dust no one knew how to sweep away. And Abdullah himself, sensing how far he had fallen in the eyes of his clan, found himself staring into an emptiness he had spent years refusing to acknowledge, a loneliness born not from betrayal, but from the consequences of choices that could no longer be undone. The fallout from the Masjid al-Dirar incident lingered over Medina like a thin, gray mist, subtle, yet impossible to ignore. Even after the building was dismantled and the smoke drifted away, the implications remained suspended in the air, especially for the man whose shadow had been quietly woven into its creation. Abdullah ibn Ubayy had weathered many blows to his reputation over the years, but this one felt different. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It didn't erupt into confrontation. It simply settled. A quiet verdict the entire community understood without needing to say it aloud. And nowhere was this verdict felt more strongly than among his own tribe, the Khazraj. For decades, Abdullah had been the tribe's pride. Before Islam reshaped Medina, he had been their almost king, the man they believed would unite the city and usher in a new age of stability. His name had carried weight in every negotiation, his approval sought in every dispute. The tribe had once rallied behind him, not only out of loyalty, but out of genuine belief that he was the best of them. Now, those same men and women struggled to meet his eyes. It wasn't betrayal. It wasn't anger. It was something far more painful: disappointment. A collective realization that the man they once lifted so high had drifted somewhere they could no longer follow. Elders who had long defended him began stepping back, gently at first. They still greeted him with respect, but the pauses afterward grew longer, the conversations shorter. They no longer asked his opinion on matters of the clan. They no longer sought his mediation in family disputes. Instead, they turned to men whose loyalty to the prophet had proven sincere through sacrifice, endurance, and consistency. Young men, the same ones who once looked at Abdullah with admiration, now watched him the way people watch a fading monument, with a touch of sadness, a measure of confusion, and the quiet understanding that its time had passed. They didn't mock him. They didn't challenge him. They simply outgrew him. Every time he approached a group from his tribe, he saw subtle shifts, a slight straightening of posture, a pause in conversation, an awkward shuffle that betrayed unspoken discomfort. People weren't avoiding him because they hated him. They were avoiding him because they no longer knew how to stand beside him without feeling a whisper of guilt themselves. His closest supporters, the handful of men who had remained near him out of habit, began drifting as well. Some left quietly, slipping into new circles where sincerity was valued more than political memory. Others stayed a little longer, but spoke less, contributed little, and eventually stopped showing up altogether. Their departures weren't dramatic. They were gradual, the way seasons change when you aren't paying close attention. One day, he looked around and realized he stood alone. Even within his household, the atmosphere shifted. His wife and children treated him with the respect owed to a husband and father, but the warmth had thinned. His sons, especially the devout Abdullah, prayed more often at the mosque, seeking clarity and peace away from the tension that had settled over their home. His daughters spoke softly, choosing their words with a new kind of caution. His wife watched him with the eyes of someone who still cared deeply but no longer knew how to help a man who was crumbling from wounds he refused to name. Abdullah felt the distance growing, and it terrified him. He had built his identity on leadership, on fiqh, on the ability to shape the city's political tides. But now, with every passing day, he felt the sands sliding out from under him. His tribe was not abandoning him suddenly. They were simply recognizing that he had already let go of the ideals that once made him worthy of following. He felt old, not in years, but in relevance. The energy that once propelled him had evaporated. His thoughts, once sharp with strategy, now turned in slow, heavy circles of regret and resentment. His pride, the very thing that had sustained him through so many crises, had become a weight he couldn't put down. And as he withdrew further into himself, the signs of physical decline began to appear. Fatigue that lingered longer than it should, breath that felt shorter, nights where sleep escaped him entirely. Medina was moving toward its next chapter, bright and unified. Abdullah, once meant to lead it, was fading into the margins. And in that quiet, painful transition, the end of his life began drawing near, an ending he sensed, even if he would never openly admit it. The years that followed the Masjid al-Dirar incident seemed to drain the strength from Abdullah ibn Ubayy one day at a time. He had once walked the streets of Yathrib, Medina now, with the steady stride of a man accustomed to admiration. But those days had slipped behind him quietly, imperceptibly, until the change became too obvious to ignore. His back bent slightly, his steps slowed, his voice, once sharp and confident, softened into something brittle around the edges. Age alone could not explain the decline. It was the weight he carried inside. Years of resentment, political disappointment, moral missteps, and the slow realization that the city he lived in no longer had space for the man he thought himself to be. The Khazraj had distanced themselves after Masjid al-Dirar. His inner circle had grown thin, and those who remained near him did so more out of habit than conviction. Loneliness, for a man who once expected to rule, was a heavier burden then illness. Slowly, Abdullah withdrew from public life. He stopped attending community discussions except when duty required it. He no longer offered opinions, not because he had none, but because he knew they carried no influence. When he spoke, people listened politely, as one listens to an elder whose time has passed, respectful but without weight. Their eyes drifted elsewhere. Their hearts were focused on other leaders now, men and women of sincerity and sacrifice. At home, he spent long stretches sitting quietly, staring at the walls or the courtyard, lost in thoughts he never voiced. His children tended to him with dutiful affection, but something unspoken hung between them, something neither side dared confront. They loved him, he loved them, but they also saw him clearly now, without the illusions that once veiled his flaws. And he saw, in their softened voices and careful expressions, that love did not erase truth. His body began to fail him in small ways at first. A cough that lingered, a stiffness that made mornings difficult, a fatigue that settled deep in his bones. But most of all, there was a heaviness in his chest that no medicine seemed able to ease. His attendants brought remedies. His family hovered with concern. But Abdullah himself whispered to no one that he felt something tightening inside, as though his time was beginning to fold inward, preparing to close. He slept more, and when he did, he dreamed not of glory, but of moments he wished he could undo, turning back at Uhud, whispering during the slander, the painful confrontation at the city gate, the quiet shame of Tabuk. Dreams that weren't punishments, but reflections, mirrors held up to choices he had spent years trying to excuse. Regret does not always arrive with tears or desperate apologies. Sometimes it settles quietly, like dust on a windowsill. Abdullah felt that dust gathering in his heart. The community, meanwhile, continued growing. More delegations arrived in Medina. The Muslim world expanded, tribes pledging allegiance, people entering Islam in waves. The city buzzed with purpose. And though Abdullah watched this growth, it often felt as though he were watching someone else's story, one he had brushed against, resisted, and ultimately lost his place in. Occasionally, someone would visit him out of courtesy, a companion, a clan member. They would ask about his health, offer simple encouragement, then leave with gentle smiles. They meant well, but each visit reminded him that he was no longer a man whose words shaped anything. His influence had dissolved, evaporated into the air like breath on a cold morning. Despite all of this, a strange tenderness began to touch his thoughts in these final months. He didn't express it out loud, but he softened. The bitterness he once clung to began slipping from his fingers, not because he wanted to release it, simply because he no longer had the strength to hold it. Pride is heavy, and in frailty, the heart sometimes relinquishes what the strong self refuses to surrender. He found himself thinking often about the Prophet, not with rivalry anymore, nor irritation, nor wounded ego, but with a tired, complicated respect. The kind of respect one feels when looking back at a mountain they once tried foolishly to climb from the wrong side. And then, one night, as his breath grew shallow and his awareness flickered in and out like a dimming lamp, an idea formed within him. an idea that felt both impossible and necessary. He wanted something from the prophet, something only the prophet could grant, something that would make his final moments feel less like an ending shaped by conflict and more like a final attempt at connection, at forgiveness, at acknowledgement that he had finally understood the truth he had resisted for so long. That final request, controversial, heartfelt, and deeply revealing, would shape how his story closed and how Medina remembered him after he was gone. The days following Abdullah ibn Ubay's sharpest decline felt strangely quiet. The man who had once filled rooms with his presence now barely filled the space around his own bed. His breath came in soft, uneven waves. His voice, once crafted with political precision, had thinned into a whisper. Illness wrapped around him like a shroud before the shroud, and as his strength faded, so too did the bitterness that had consumed so much of his life. In its absence, something else appeared. Fear, yes, but also clarity. A clarity he had outrun for years. He knew the end was close. And in those final days, one lingering desire tugged at him. The hope that even after so many missteps, so many shadows, the door of mercy had not fully closed. He could not undo what had been done. But perhaps he could leave this world wrapped in something other than resentment. Perhaps he could step into the next with a gesture of reconciliation, however small. So, he made a request, quiet, hesitant, trembling at the edges. He asked for the prophet to come. When the prophet arrived, Abdullah struggled to sit up, his body resisting him in a way it never had during his years of prideful stride. The companions watched with a mixture of caution and compassion. Some wondered what ulterior motive might linger behind the request. Others suspected it was simply the plea of a man finally facing truths he had spent a lifetime avoiding. Abdullah's eyes lifted with difficulty, but when they met the prophet's eye, something softened. Years of tension, rivalry, jealousy, and quiet opposition seemed to collapse into that single gaze. And in his broken, fragile voice, he made the request that would echo through time. He asked for the prophet's cloak, his own blessed garment, to be used as his burial shroud. A request unimaginable years earlier. A request unthinkable coming from the man who had undermined, whispered, stirred doubt. A request revealing a heart that, in its final breaths, sought dignity not through authority, but through nearness to the one he had spent so long resisting. And the prophet granted it, without hesitation, without anger, without reference to the past. He removed his cloak and handed it to Abdullah's son, who stood nearby with tears already gathering in his eyes. The companions were stunned, not because the prophet showed compassion, he always did, but because this act was mercy in its purest, most disarming form. It wasn't an endorsement of Abdullah's life. It wasn't a political gesture. It was simply the prophet responding to a dying man's final plea with kindness that transcended rivalry. For a moment, Abdullah seemed lighter. His breathing eased. His shoulders, tense with decades of pride, finally relaxed. Gratitude flickered across his face, faint but unmistakable, like the last glow of a lamp nearing the end of its oil. He knew he could not change the past. He knew history would remember him unfavorably. But perhaps, in this final gesture, He felt a fragile hope that God's mercy might still reach him. The cloak wasn't just fabric. It was a symbol, one he had once despised, then feared, and now clung to with the trembling hands of a man who finally understood what truly held value. The companions exchanged glances, each wrestling with their emotions. Some felt relief that even a complicated soul like Abdullah's could receive kindness at the end. Others struggled with the weight of his legacy, yet none questioned the Prophet's decision. They knew better than to assume where divine mercy might fall. As the room settled into a heavy silence, Abdullah leaned back onto his cushion, the cloak now resting beside him, its presence both comforting and humbling. His breaths grew slower. His strength seeped away, and soon, very soon, Medina would gather to bury the man who had been almost a king, then almost a leader, then almost a believer in the way he needed to be. The next chapter begins at that final moment when life slips into death, and Medina must reckon not only with the burial of its most controversial figure, but with the meaning of mercy in the face of a complicated legacy. The day of Abdullah ibn Ubayy's burial arrived with a strange, heavy quiet, one that settled over Medina like a fog. Not the silence of respect, nor the silence of grief, but something more uncertain, more complicated. People gathered not because they loved him or admired him, but because he had been part of the city's story from the beginning. To ignore his death felt unnatural. To mourn him felt untruthful. And in that tension stood the Prophet, carrying a compassion wide enough to embrace even the most difficult souls. Word spread quickly that the Prophet intended to lead the funeral prayer. For many, this was bewildering. Abdullah's life had been a long tapestry of contradictions, moments of civility, shadows of resentment, gestures of cooperation, laced with whispers of opposition. He had hurt the community, undermined it, and caused deep wounds. Yet the Prophet stood ready to offer him a final kindness, a mercy rooted not in approval of his actions, but in the Prophet's own immense heart. Some companions, unable to reconcile this act with the pain Abdullah had caused, approached respectfully. Among them was Umar ibn al-Khattab, R.A., whose clarity and decisiveness often cut through the fog of ambiguity. His voice, firm yet reverent, expressed the concerns many held quietly. "Messenger of Allah," he said, "will you pray for him after all that he has done?" It wasn't defiance. It was care. Care for the community, for precedent, for sincerity. But the Prophet Tiras, whose lens saw beyond the surface of actions and into the intricacies of individual souls, replied with calm assurance. "Allah has given me a choice," he said gently, "and I have chosen." Mercy to him was not a negotiation. It was principle. He stepped forward to lead the prayer. The community stood behind him, some uneasy, some silent, some grappling with emotions they didn't know how to name. Abdullah's son, steadfast, sincere, conflicted, stood among them, hoping that this final gesture might somehow ease the burden of having loved a father whose choices had often brought pain. But before the Prophet could begin, revelation descended, sudden, clear, and decisive. It was as if the air shifted, as if the very atmosphere paused. Verses were revealed instructing the prophet not to seek forgiveness for Abdullah, even if he were to do so many times over. The line between compassion and divine justice, once blurred by the prophet's gentle heart, was now illuminated with unmistakable clarity. The prophet stepped back from the prayer. The companions were stunned, not by the instruction itself, but by what it meant. It wasn't a condemnation of the prophet's mercy. It was a boundary drawn by the one who sees what no human heart can fully comprehend. It was a reminder that divine wisdom operates on a scale far beyond human tenderness or grievance. Abdullah's son lowered his gaze, not in shame, but in acceptance. He understood now that the prophet had gone as far as compassion could reach, and that what lay beyond was a matter between his father and the one who knows every secret of the soul. What unfolded that day became a lesson woven into the memory of Medina. A lesson that mercy has no limits when it comes from the prophet, but divine revelation sets the final terms. A lesson that leadership is not only in kindness, but in submitting to divine instruction, even when it challenges personal inclination. And a lesson that every life, no matter how conflicted, flawed, or tangled, leaves behind a legacy that others must reflect upon. As the burial proceeded without the prayer Abdullah's son had hoped for, the community felt something shift. Not relief, not triumph, but a sobering awareness of the gravity of sincerity, intention, and the unseen reality of hearts. And in that silence, the story of Abdullah ibn Ubayy began transforming into what it would ultimately become. A legacy not of political ambition or tribal power, but of complicated lessons about pride, consequence, mercy, and the boundaries of compassion. A legacy that would echo in the reflections of Medina for years to come. Legacy is a strange thing. It rarely belongs to the one who lived the life. Instead, it becomes something shaped by those who survive, by those who tell the story, by those who choose which moments mattered and which moments can fade into silence. And for Abdullah ibn Ubayy, once the nearly crowned leader of Yathrib, and later the most complicated figure in Medina, this was truer than for almost anyone of his era. When he left the world, he left no lasting speeches, no poetic verses, no great achievements written in stone. What he left behind were memories, fragmented, inconsistent, and deeply colored by the emotional storms he had helped stir. His own tribe, the Khazraj, remembered him with a strange mixture of loyalty and embarrassment. They could not deny he was once their hope, the man they believed would unify Yathrib before the winds of destiny changed direction. But they also could not deny the countless moments where he faltered, resisted, or quietly opposed the very unity that ultimately saved their city. Among the companions of the prophet Tio, his story became a reminder of sincerity, of hypocrisy, of how fragile the human heart can be when pride becomes heavier than truth. They spoke of him not with hatred, but with caution, a life that demonstrated the danger of clinging to status when life demands humility instead. Historians would later turn his life into a narrative shaped by the needs of their time. Some painted him as a villain, the archetypal hypocrite whose every action was poisoned with insincerity. Others saw him as a tragic figure, a man caught between two eras, unable to accept that the world had shifted beneath his feet. A few tried to understand him, his hopes, his fears, the political instinct that once made him respected, and the emotional wounds that led him astray. But in every version of his story, one theme remained. He did not control how he would be remembered. Even his own children lived in ways that redefined his legacy. His son, Abdullah, loyal, principled, unwavering in faith, became a contrast so sharp that many could not speak of one without mentioning the other. Where the father represented hesitation, the son represented commitment. Where the father stumbled, the son stood firm. And history embraced the son far more warmly than the father. The storytellers of Medina, those who grew old retelling the earliest days of Islam, rarely lingered on Abdullah's small acts of kindness or moments of clarity. They remembered the times that shook the community, the withdrawal at Uhud, the whispers surrounding the slander, the statement that nearly tore the Ansar apart. These moments became touchstones in sermons, reminders in lectures, lessons in gatherings. He became a symbol, not a man of flesh and emotion, but an emblem of what happens when pride overshadows sincerity, a case study in spiritual imbalance, a warning spoken gently, especially to those who found themselves struggling with jealousy, fear of irrelevance, or the urge to cling too tightly to the past. And yet, beneath all the layers of interpretation, one truth quietly persisted. Abdullah ibn Ubayy was human. Flawed, yes. Misguided, often. But also vulnerable, frightened, and shaped by wounds that no one around him fully understood. His path from respected elder to troubled opponent was not a leap, but a slow unraveling. A story that could have belonged to many others had their circumstances been even slightly different. In the dim lights of nighttime storytelling, some narrators softened their tone when speaking of him. They noted the prophet's compassion toward him, right until the end. They mentioned his final request, the cloak, the prayer, and how even in the face of revelation's limits, mercy still played a role. They suggested that his life, rather than being a tale of condemnation, might instead be a lesson in the delicate nature of the human heart. For legacy is not simply about judgment. It is also about understanding. And Abdullah's legacy, complex, uncomfortable, tangled in emotion, became a mirror for anyone who has struggled between who they were, who they wanted to be, and who the world asked them to become. It is this tension, this fragile human truth, that sets the stage for the final reflection, what his life ultimately teaches those willing to look past the symbol and into the story itself. History is often cruel in its summaries. It turns men into symbols, symbols into warnings, and warnings into stories repeated for generations without ever asking whether the man at the center of it all would have recognized himself in the telling. Abdullah ibn Ubayy, once poised to be the most powerful man in Yathrib, became one such story, an emblem of hypocrisy, of misaligned ambition, of a heart forever caught between pride and possibility. But beneath those labels lies something far more human, a life shaped by choices made in moments of fear, ego, and pain. His journey forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that leadership is not merely about position, but about character. Abdullah never lacked the skills. He had political instinct, negotiation experience, social awareness. What he lacked was the ability to let go of the world he believed he deserved. His resistance to change wasn't the rebellion of a villain. It was the desperation of a man who felt the ground shifting beneath him faster than he could adjust. He had lived long enough to build an identity rooted in authority, and when that identity cracked, he didn't know how to rebuild it. Ambition on its own is not destructive. Many leaders rose through ambition, but Abdullah's ambition was never recentered after Islam transformed Medina. Instead of letting go of the old order, he tried to force it into coexistence with the new. Instead of embracing sincerity, he clung to reputation. Instead of allowing humility to soften him, he allowed humiliation to harden him. And humiliation, especially when unprocessed, rarely shapes noble decisions. Insecurity played an even deeper role. He watched as others became what he once expected himself to be. He saw young men rise with moral clarity that outshined his own sophisticated but heavy-hearted leadership. He saw faith give people a strength that political power had never given him, and the more he saw, the smaller he felt. Insecurity is a quiet killer. It doesn't strike in obvious moments. It corrodes from within, bending intentions, altering reactions, shaping words before they're spoken. Abdullah's resentment was not born overnight. It grew chapter by chapter, disappointment by disappointment. The arrival of the prophet didn't instantly turn him into an enemy. It simply forced him to confront a future where he was no longer the center. And when he couldn't accept that, resentment filled the space humility should have occupied. Resentment, once nurtured, begins to spill into every word, every whisper, every choice. It blinds a man to the good unfolding around him. It makes cooperation feel like surrender. It makes unity feel like defeat. Yet even as resentment shaped him, the tragedy of Abdullah lies in the fact that he was not beyond redemption. He simply never allowed himself to step fully into sincerity. There were moments where he could have chosen differently, where humility could have healed him, where loyalty could have softened his exile, where honesty could have freed him from the loneliness of living behind a mask. But choices, once repeated enough times, become habits. Habits become character, and character becomes destiny. It is easy to judge him from a distance, to say he failed, or betrayed, or resisted. But to understand him is to recognize the fragility of the human heart. Abdullah's tragedy is not that he was evil. It is that he was ordinary in his fears, yet placed in extraordinary circumstances. His mistakes were the kinds anyone could make when watching the world change too quickly, when clinging to an identity slipping away, when pride becomes the last shield against irrelevance. His life teaches that leadership without sincerity collapses. That influence without integrity evaporates. That resentment rots the soul faster than failure ever could. And that the greatest tragedies are often not the things that happen to us, but the choices we make when confronted with discomfort. And now, with his journey fully unraveled, his ambitions, his wounds, his flaws, his consequences, the story turns toward its closing, where the lessons of his life settle like dust around us. A final reflection awaits, soft but heavy, asking what remains when a man's actions outlive him. The emotional closing begins there, at the threshold of a life remembered not for its victories, but for the echoes of choices that shaped its end. History often remembers men like roaring storms, powerful, undeniable, reshaping everything in their path. But Abdullah ibn Ubayy did not end as a storm. He faded like a sigh at dusk, quiet and nearly invisible. Even though the noise of his life had once threatened to shake Medina. His story closed not with confrontation or rebellion, but with a gentle dimming, the kind that leaves people wondering whether the man they spent years discussing and fearing had ever truly understood the world he lived in. As Medina continued to grow, spiritually, socially, politically, Abdullah's name grew softer on people's tongues, not gone, never forgotten, but less urgent, less sharp, like a stone once thrown into water, whose ripples had finally stopped moving. His legacy settled into stillness, even while the city he had tried so hard to shape marched confidently into a future he could never have imagined for himself. People rarely spoke about him directly in the years that followed. Instead, he appeared only in reflections, in lessons, in stories shared to warn against arrogance, duplicity, and the fragile loneliness of a heart unable to let go of the past. Companions would sometimes mention him when discussing sincerity or leadership, their voices neither angry nor mocking, just honest, calm, as if they had come to see him not as a villain, but as a caution crafted out of human weakness. And that was perhaps the saddest and most merciful part of it all. His story did not end with hatred. It ended with understanding. However reluctant, people recognized that Abdullah had not been monstrous. He had been human, deeply human. Human enough to dream, human enough to fail, human enough to crumble beneath the weight of expectations he could never fulfill. Late at night, when Medina grew silent and lanterns flickered softly behind mud-brick walls, one could almost imagine Abdullah's presence lingering in the quiet edges of the city he once hoped to rule, not haunting it, but blending into it. A reminder of a time before unity, before revelation, before hearts learned to walk in one direction. A reminder of how messy, painful, and complicated transformation can be for those caught between eras. For Abdullah was exactly that, a man caught between worlds. One foot in the old tribal order, one foot reluctantly dragged into the new moral universe Islam introduced. He lived at the hinge of history, a place where pressure is immense and clarity is rare. Some men at the hinge rise and reshape themselves. Others cling to their fragments until the hinge closes on its own. Abdullah clung. And yet, even in clinging, his story helped illuminate truths that outlived him. He became an example of how ambition without humility corrodes from the inside, how leadership without sincerity collapses under the slightest weight, how pride can blind even the most intelligent men to the beauty blooming right in front of them, and how resentment, if fed for too long, devours a person until nothing remains but regret. But in the soft stillness of historical reflection, his life also teaches something gentler, that even the most difficult people are shaped by fear more than malice, by longing more than cruelty, by wounds more than wickedness. And in that understanding, Abdullah becomes not just a warning, but a mirror, inviting listeners to examine their own hearts for the small seeds of bitterness that, if unguarded, can grow into forests of sorrow. So tonight, as you rest and let your mind drift toward sleep, imagine the quiet sands of Medina settling around a man who once believed he would be king. Imagine his footsteps fading into the earth, little by little, until they become just another part of the landscape. History may speak loudly of heroes, battles, revelations, and triumphs, but it also whispers the stories of those who stood at the edges, who stumbled, who faltered, who remind us, gently, painfully, that human weakness has always walked beside human greatness. And in that whisper, Abdullah ibn Ubayy finds his final place, a quiet ending in a loud history, a soft echo, teaching us that every life, even one steeped in conflict and contradiction, has something to offer those willing to listen in the stillness. Rest now. Let the story settle. Let the noise of the world fade, and drift gently into sleep, carrying only the lessons, not the heaviness, of the man history learned to remember softly.